a writer of mysteries and thrillers. I've written or published 17 books in that genre, and if you have any interest at all in my stuff, you just have to Google Chris Knopf mystery, and you'll learn more about me than you ever wanted to know. And I'm a board member with Mystery Writers of America, the New York chapter, so they're co-sponsors of this. And I'm involved with these sorts of library programs. That's my main gig. We'll start with Matt.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Matthew Farrell. My debut thriller, What Have You Done, came out in October 2018. Was a Washington Post and Amazon charts bestseller, sold in 17 countries. Movie rights were sold. So it was quite the successful debut. My follow-up came out this past August called I Know Everything. Debuted in the top 5 on the Amazon charts in the US and the UK. And just happy to be here, happy to talk a little forensics tonight.
Thank you.
Hi everyone, and thanks for coming in this terrible weather. My name is Suzanne Chazen. I'm a local writer. I live here in Chappaqua. I am the author of 2 mystery series. My first series stars a young female fire marshal for the New York City Fire Department named Georgia Skehan. And that series debuted actually a long time ago in 2001. And that series got a lot of really good play from the USA Today, People Magazine, a lot of pretty good stuff. That was 3 volumes. Currently, I write a series that takes place in a fictional version of Westchester. It's a mystery series that deals with the undocumented community and deals with a detective, a county detective, solving crimes that really sort of reveal some of the state of our world these days. That series has been, the first one in that one was a top 5 pick from the American Library Association, and it has had Amazon Pick of the Month and starred reviews repeatedly. Thanks for being here.
Hi, I think I come from the farthest away. I came all the way from Manhattan. My name's Carol Bugay, and thank you so much for every single person who came here in this horrible weather. Thank you so much for coming. I feel like you should all get a treat. I actually brought 2 books that I'm giving away. These are my 2 latest series. I have too many pen names. Carol Bugay, I have my first 2 series under that, and then C.E. Lawrence, my next series, and then my new historical thrillers under Carol Lawrence, and then Elizabeth Blake, yes! Pride, Prejudice, and Poison, and I should have added, and tea, and cats, and lots of tea and cats. So if you're a cozy fan, this is a very dark thriller, historical thriller. So I'm giving these away. First 2 people who come up, they're yours. Okay?
Thank you, guys. So this panel discussion is on forensics, and they all know that our opening question is, what role does forensics play in your work? I think the extremes would be it's very pivotal to somewhat ancillary or on the outside. So Carol, why don't you kick that off?
Okay. So this volume is good? You can hear? It's good? Okay, no clapping. Well, the fun thing about writing historical fiction is that forensics was really just starting, and so this book takes place in 1880, so I've had a lot of fun with, had fingerprints started? Well, kind of in 1860, but not really. People don't know about it yet. There's nothing really published until 1895. So forensics, so I'm playing around with the idea that my detective is kind of in the birth time of forensics. With the more contemporary things that I write, definitely forensics are inescapable. I mean, they're absolutely key to every story. This is an amateur sleuth, so I had to make her a crime buff so that she understands forensics. And I think a lot of people these days think they understand forensics, whether or not they do. But yeah, I have to say, it's inescapable, yeah.
How about you, Suzanne?
Well, my 2 series are rather different in the sense that the first series that I did was about fire, and they are really, gee whiz, the science of fire. That's a really big part of the series, and I really worked with the science of fire. I talked to ATF people, and I talked to people who really work on a daily basis, fire marshals with the FDNY, who look at fire and the science of that. My second series, interestingly, it's modern day, and one of the big problems now is when you go to create a situation where there's a mystery, it's much harder for things to be a mystery. So yes, there's very much the forensics in there, but it's always a matter of trying to figure out how to make something plausible that someone wouldn't know. And like what Carol does, it's probably how would they ever even know that? And mine is, of course they'd know that. Now how could you make it so that they might not know it?
Well, but can I also introduce, since you're doing fire investigations?
Well, one series is fire and one series is not.
Yeah, it's really, fire investigation is really interesting because I watch every true crime show that's ever been on television. And there's some really, really interesting cases, I don't know if you're aware of these, where one fire expert came in and called it murder, and then someone came in and did a re-examination of the crime scene using more advanced science and actually proved fairly conclusively that it wasn't murder.
Can I piggyback on
Yeah,
that?
please,
Because
please.
there was a piece in the New Yorker a few years ago, and a lot of times as far as the death penalty goes, people say, well, no one innocent was ever executed. Well, that's not true. And they absolutely know this for a fact because there was a person, a man, I can't remember his name, but he was convicted of the murders of his children by fire. And what happened was there was no good forensic fire investigation at the time, and they would not stay the execution. But after he died, some really top-notch specialists proved that it was indeed a space heater, and that this man was basically convicted because his reactions were not what one would expect for a man whose children were dying in the fire. And he was basically convicted and executed on his reactions. So it's a wonderful piece if you want to look it up. It was in the New Yorker, and it was really a piece about how, just what you were saying,
Yeah.
that fire can be very interesting because unlike other types of murder investigations, you don't absolutely know that there was anybody responsible.
Yeah, and a lot of forensics are like that. A lot of forensics are far, far less definite than we think they are. And the science is always advancing, but I don't want to take away.
Go ahead.
You're up, Matt.
So my niche is I write psychological thrillers that mix in police procedurals. So in my first book, one of the main characters was a forensic scientist, and in my second book, there was just forensics involved in the investigation. And being such a fan of kind of just the thriller genre, the police procedural, the murder mystery on TV or a movie, I don't bog my book down on too much of the science of it. I kind of just give the reader enough to know what they're doing and why, and then I kind of use it as a catalyst to get to the next part of the story or move the story along. The example I always use is, when I was reading Jurassic Park, Michael Crichton spent 40 pages telling me how to extract DNA from a mosquito, fossilized mosquito. I just wanted dinosaurs to eat somebody. So I use it to kind of.
See, and I really like that.
Yeah, no,
I love that DNA.
Everybody's different. So how I use it is I kind of just use it to push the story along. I don't get too deep into it, and then that's just how I do it.
I think that's really smart, the way you're handling it, but I also think that with Crichton, and I talk about this in my writing classes, if he didn't do that obligatory scene where he said, you think this is impossible, I'll show you why it's not.
Yeah,
the
right.
whole story is built on that premise.
Right.
So I feel like he had to do some version of that.
Yeah, that's true.
And in the movie, it really works. I didn't read the book,
Fantastic.
but...
Well, Suzanne, could you address that concept? Because my next question was, can reality of, well, two-part really, the reality of forensics and this challenge that we have to put technical information into our work in order to support some of the premises and so forth, can that really get in the way of storytelling? I think we heard already from these guys how they approach that.
It's interesting. What Matt's saying is true, that you can't get so bogged down in that technical stuff that you lose the reader. And it's a really fine balance because obviously the first goal of the mystery writer is to entertain. You've got to be entertained. It's not a science book. But at the same time, it can be entertaining. The details can be entertaining, but what you have to do is, it's usually a case of putting more in and taking some of it out.
Yeah.
And sometimes the most fun I ever have is with the thing that you're not expecting. So you don't want the reader going, okay, they did this, they did the autopsy, they found out this, they found out that. Okay, well, we know that. But what about something they're not expecting? And what about something that can't be explained easily? And I think that's where the mystery and where the fun comes in.
And also, I think it also depends on the book you're writing or reading. I mean, I think, if you're writing a Sherlock Holmes book, you can get a little bit more detailed and a little deeper into it because he builds his whole methodology on, getting in there and teaching others as he's uncovering the clues. When I'm writing a thriller, my agent, my editor is constantly, the reader needs to want to turn the next page. They don't want, you don't want them to put the book down. You want them to stay up later than they usually do reading the book. So that's kind of where we come from. The different.
And I was really learning as you're going along. So the chief toxicologist of New York City was a friend of mine because she was a Sherlockian, as she called herself, and some of my books are Sherlock Holmes novels. So she took me through the toxicology lab, and of course I wanted to smell cyanide. I'm like, I want to smell cyanide. Guess what percentage of people can smell the bitter almonds in cyanide? Anybody know? 1/3. I was not in that lucky third. So she opened the thing and I'm like, nope, don't smell anything. It was so disappointing. But on the other hand, it was interesting learning. I had always just thought, oh yeah, cyanide, yeah, it's bitter almonds, everyone smells. No, it's only 1/3 of the population.
And that brings up a good point, is that you have to have that grounding in the knowledge, because for instance, I've never researched it. So my first thought would be, if I was writing about it, I would think everybody smells the bitter almonds. So I probably would have just, without researching it, thought, oh well, they smell it. But that's in itself a kind of gee whiz.
Yeah.
And could be interesting if you play it into something
Yeah,
where a
one
character
can
doesn't
and one
smell it
can,
and one
yeah.
character
Right,
does.
and that's what I was just going to say. If you wrote that if they smelled it, most of the readers would not know the 1/3 and just
Yeah.
move on with the story and everything's fine. But the fact that if you did know that, it could be a nice little.
Yeah, twist.
Just something
Someone
you
could
put in your
claim
back
that they
pocket.
smelled it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you didn't drop dead, which is a plus, right? I mean, you must have counted that as, a positive outcome.
And we're going
You
to
were
get
killed by
smelling
them.
afterwards. Everybody's going to get to smell.
Yeah, if you have a chance, go to a toxicology lab and see if you're one of those people. It's deeply disappointing to not be one, though.
So, you guys have all kind of touched on the fact that forensics is not an exact science, even though TV and movies would try to make us think that. But it's also evolving rapidly, constantly. So I'm going to start with you, Suzanne. How do you keep up with all that stuff, and how sensitive are you to that, worrying about that?
Oh, who are you starting with?
Suzanne.
Oh,
Suzanne.
well, I'll tell you something interesting I just read the other day. I'm sure a lot of people know about this Golden State Killer and how he was caught by the DNA. That's changing. Can't do that anymore. Now it turns out that's going to be much harder, because now all the DNA sites are saying, wait a minute, it's not constitutionally okay for the police to come in and take a private database and go skimming it for something.
Why don't you explain more about what happened?
Okay, so for those of you who don't know, there was a killer in California called the Golden State Killer. Nobody could find him. He operated for several decades, raping, murdering, and everything. They had his DNA, but they did not know who he was, because he was obviously someone who had never committed a crime, where he had committed a felony, so that his DNA would be in the database. So the investigators over all of California were stumped. They didn't know what to do, so somebody got the bright idea. Well, why don't we, one of the problems is DNA heritage. When you want to look up your heritage, you do it from a saliva swab. But what they had was they had semen. They didn't have saliva, and apparently you can't test the same way. So they had to reconstitute the semen they had to become like a saliva swab. And then they had to send it in anonymously and pretend that it was somebody looking for their history. And then they found distant relatives to this Golden State Killer. And then slowly but surely they worked their way until they finally found this guy. So now let's say you're the modern writer, mystery writer, you go, I'm going to make that story. Well, you can't. Well, I mean, you can, but it won't be correct, because now Genentech and all these places are making all sorts of rules saying you need a court order. You need to prove that there's no other way you can get the information. You can only do it if it's a serious crime. You know, so there's a lot of things like that. Is there a question?
And a more cutting edge, I'm not interrupting you.
No, I think I saw a question. I do.
Yeah, actually, because if it's been making the rules, how would they stop someone from submitting
Well,
the sample if it's not illegal by law?
No, what's happening is
Question, so we get it on tape.
I'm sorry. Oh, so the question is, how would they stop someone from submitting, the police, you mean, from submitting a sample? Well, first of all, the police, then that evidence that they find might be not included in the court.
Well, but that would have to, it would have to then be legal, I mean, just because.
What happens is, what's happening now is the DNA places are now having a new thing where when you go give your swab, you sign off the right to refuse to be part of a database search.
Right.
And so they're doing that. Plus, they're also, the judges are now saying, I will not look at this, I will not allow the police to go in this direction unless they can show me there's no other way to get this evidence and the crime warrants it. So in other words, you know, I get some DNA from a burglary and I go to the judge is going to go, forget it, you're not getting that. That's not what you're going to do. So all I'm saying is that if you were a writer now, you would have to consider that overnight something that was amazing has turned into something that's much more complicated.
And these were, just to refine that a little bit more, the databases that the cops went to were all open source, and they had all agreed to just leave it open out there in the world. So I think, frankly, that was perfectly fair. So the ones that you know about, like Ancestry and all, they already had that pretty much contained, where you just couldn't go in unless you were somehow accepted within the family.
There's even a more new cutting-edge use of DNA. It sounds almost impossible, and I've seen it twice on shows, and it's incredible to me. There's a company now that's taking the DNA and actually constructing what the person looks like. It's a cutting-edge new use of DNA, and they can actually map out the characteristics of the person. How they do it, I don't know, and it takes a long time, but I've seen a couple of examples on various shows. I think one was actually 60 Minutes, of a woman who works with this company and does this kind of work.
Yeah, that's another thing about how you just have to really keep up with this stuff, because there's a lot of, and I'm going to try to address this later on, but I've got a lot of stuff in my old books, in my former books, that are just isn't accurate anymore, and you just kind of hope that the reader who's knowledgeable about this stuff gives you a pass, because they were accurate at the time, but it has changed a lot. This gentleman has a question.
I wanted to ask, here in America, we're used to the term the medical examiner. If you watch anything in Britain, it's a coroner. Is there a distinction?
Yes.
Are there coroners in this country?
There
Yeah.
are actually, I think, 5 states.
Oh, the question was about...
The question was medical examiners versus coroners, and the term coroner originally just meant working for the king. I mean, that's, and that's where that term comes from originally. And then by far most of the states in this country have medical examiners, but there are still 5 commonwealths, I think it's 5, that still have coroners. But all the rest of the states have medical examiners.
And can I say something? A coroner does not have to have any medical training at all. A coroner can be elected. So I can be a coroner. And I have no medical training, and you would not want me to do your medical training. But a medical examiner is licensed, board certified, and all of that. So they are vastly different. And where that comes into play is, as you said, there are some states that still allow, and some counties that allow coroners. So can you imagine when a coroner makes a decision as to whether it's a murder or a suicide or accidental death, and what the means are, how seriously that can impact the lives of people who might be accused of a crime?
And there are several historical cases where that's actually happened, where the coroner just came in and made determinations with just almost no medical knowledge whatsoever. So I think the movement in this country towards medical examiners is a good thing. I don't really know that much about how it operates in England.
No.
I just got back from 5 weeks there, and I forgot to ask that.
Be assured that in New York and Connecticut and the populated states in the Northeast, they're very professional, and the ME sits in the back at the labs, and they send out representative death investigators who do the field work, and it's very scientifically sound. So Matt, you've had to have done some research in order to write the books that you write. How did you go about that? I mean, we hear about Lee Laughlin's Police Academy. I don't know if you're familiar
Yep.
with that guy, and but there's interviewing individuals and among the law enforcement and so forth. But how did you handle that?
So my father's retired police. From there, we've got family friends. I've got childhood friends that are on the state police, NYPD. So through their contacts, I don't dive too deep into it, but you need to be steeped in some kind of reality. So I'll shoot them a list of questions, or I'll call them up on a random Tuesday night and say, hey, I was choking somebody. What would this happen? What would this look like? And what kind of bruising would I be looking for, and that kind of thing. So definitely law enforcement. Circle of law enforcement, friends and family that I have. And then just kind of, to Carol's point, we do a lot of true crime shows on TV. I'm always watching or reading something that has to do with a police investigation, just because it's just my thing. So pick up a little bit of, things like that as well. I think the biggest, as a crime writer, thriller writer, suspense novelist, I think the hardest thing these days is not just the forensics piece of it, but just the technology piece of it. I mean, when someone commits a crime these days, chances are they're caught on camera somewhere. Or if you're looking for someone, you can dial up their, Find My iPhone app and find them. So we have to come up with really creative ways to not make our killers look so stupid. And at the same time be able to avoid the police and the technology involved in tracking them. And I think sometimes that's harder than
That is
anything else.
Someone at Thriller Fest a couple years ago said the cell phone is the single worst thing that ever happened to crime writers.
Yes, yes.
Oh.
Well, it's funny you say that, because a lot of times you have to have something go wrong now for
Right.
somebody, so in other words, the camera has to not be working.
The battery's dead.
One of the best ones, because I asked this to a police detective once. I said to him, well, there's cameras everywhere. Why didn't you catch everybody? He goes, well, most of those cameras are in a continuous feed loop, and they rewrite themselves. He said, by the time we know that that's the camera we should have looked at, it might be past the 24-hour point. So you don't know how many times I've used that one. Because it's not realistic to say there's no camera, but it's realistic to say the camera overwrote itself already.
Yeah, that's true, and except if you're in Lower Manhattan.
Yeah.
'Cause I talked to a guy who used to work in for the, I guess it was the FBI, who worked in that field, and they keep it for months, because that's the a huge percentage of the anti-terrorism funds go into that installed base of surveillance. And if you go to Lower Manhattan, they know you, they've seen you, you're recorded, and you're not getting away with much.
Well, you don't even have to go that far. Westchester County has a center. They have their own little center that nobody really knows about, that's basically funded on forfeiture. And I researched it because I needed it for my most recent book, but basically what they do is they take all the license plate readers. Everywhere you go, there's a license plate reader. So you think you're looking at a sign that tells you, slow down, 35 miles an hour, but right over that is a license plate reader. And they get all that raw data. Now, the big problem for them isn't so much that they don't have the raw data, it's knowing what to look for. Because now what we have is we have so much information, it's figuring out what you need. But you have the license plate readers, you have the Easy Pass toll receipts, you have everyone's cell phones. They also have these fake cell phone towers that are police issued. They call them, I think, stingrays, and they get that, and all this stuff. Big Brother is watching you, and when they get something, they get their money from seizing assets. So that's how they make their money. So this is happening. You don't have to go to New York. You come right here in Westchester, and it's happening.
So it really is. I'll repeat what was said of it. That it's a huge challenge now, because as crime writers, we really have to. I mean, it often becomes a story about how to evade notice and recognition and all that, because the science and the technology is running way ahead of the average. I have a book called Dead Anyway, plug, where the guy's off the grid and he's trying to avoid anybody knowing who he is or where he is. And that was the bulk of the book, was how he navigated getting around all that stuff. If you go to a casino, forget it. Your profile, I mean, I worked for Mohegan Sun, my agency did, and you wouldn't believe the sophistication of their surveillance and profiling. Well, how about, so you guys, obviously everybody here has interviewed experts and spent time with, how about you, Carol?
Spent time with what?
With experts or people in law enforcement and that kind of thing?
Yeah. It was really fun hanging out with the toxicology lab in Manhattan, and New York City actually has a liaison, a public liaison, in the police department whose sole job it is to deal with the public. And so when I called, the police department and I got their liaison, I thought they'd go, oh really, you're writing a book? And he was like, yeah, you're writing a book. And it was like, he must deal with like 10 people a day calling for, I'm writing a crime novel. It's just, it must be constant. But my two favorite shows for research, for forensics, by the way, we were talking earlier about TV shows, I personally think the two best television shows, just straight up for forensics, are Forensic Files,
Yes.
which is off the air now, but you can catch it. There's one channel that just plays it constantly. And the other one is The New Detectives. And that's an hour-long show, and that's also really mostly based on forensics. Very, very, very much a procedural show. So if you're interested in what's going on in forensics, those are the two I like the best.
I am such a forensics file junkie. I don't know if you
love
watch
it.
it. I love forensics files. And what I love, a lot of times I speed through them because they're on like YouTube and things, you can just go right through them. And a lot of times what I'm looking for is that thing that turned the case, because as a writer, that's what I'm looking for. And I get excited not so much about what the high tech is, but by the low tech.
Yeah.
Like one of the episodes, they needed to figure out how tall a guy was. And this is such a low tech, but such a clever thing. They had video of him walking along a tile floor, and they figured out how big the tile grids were, and they figured out his positioning to the tile grids, and they were able to figure out his height. And for me, as a writer, that's very exciting, because I'm not really looking to take readers through like 14 pages of Snoresville on how you separate polymerase chain reaction DNA. I'm not interested in that. But when I have something simple like a tile floor and a guy is walking and you figure out his height from that, I'm like, yes, that's it.
That's such a good one. I don't remember that one. There's another one where a guy is fishing and he claims that he was out in the morning, but they can tell from where the shadows are in the lake that it was actually the afternoon. Stuff like that is just wicked cool.
And I have just, I'm sorry, and I was just thinking about one thing. My cousin, who used to be, of all things, a wedding photographer, I kid you not, for years and years, he's a wedding photographer, calls me up one day about 8 years ago and says, I think I'm going to become a forensic photography expert. And I said, you're a wedding photographer. You did a few calendars and you used to do the Disney weddings. Well, he turned around and he's now like one of the top people in the country, and he testifies at capital punishment things, and that's exactly what he testifies on, because it turns out that video and the light and the way the light goes can tell you time, it can tell you intent, it can tell you whether a person was alone, and he literally testifies in capital murder cases. He usually testifies for the defense side, because the prosecution actually has no money, and the defense of the people who come, because at that point it's all pro bono and they have a lot of money. So he's almost always testifying for the defense, and he's finding things that often exonerate the person or at least mitigate the circumstances.
What's the coolest thing your cousin told you?
He doesn't always tell me the cases, but what happened was he had one, I remember, where it was a shadow on a van that proved that the guy, the claim was that this particular guy had initiated he killed somebody. There's no doubt that he killed somebody, but the claim was that he had intended to attack the guy. But the nature of the shadows on the vans on the surveillance proved that he couldn't have, because he was coming from a different angle. And so clearly he reacted to something. He may have called, hey, you don't want to fight or something. But it wasn't what, they don't have audio. So it was, but clearly it wasn't what they thought it was. Or at least, let's put it this way, he was able to cast enough doubt. So this is,
That's cool.
so what you were saying is just
That's super
exactly,
cool.
super.
I love stuff like that.
So the lady right there had a question? Have any of you used smart TVs or Alexa or those kinds of technologies?
I have not. only because just the two particular stories, the books that I wrote, didn't need it, but I wouldn't, it's not something I'm adverse to. I'd use everything and anything I can to move the story along.
I haven't used it, but years and years ago, before I wrote my first novel, when I had a screaming infant and I was dealing with baby monitors back in those days, I remember hearing the story about how you could hear other people's baby monitors and what was going on, and I always thought how cool it would be to be up at 3 a.m. with your baby hearing a murder on a baby monitor. So I actually did think about that, but I never wrote it.
That has happened. There
That's
are
good.
stories about that, where
Yeah.
that did happen, where baby monitors picked up evidence of crimes. I mean, some really awful sort of, killing babies and stuff, but there's more than that, beyond that.
It's just a husband and wife. In my mind, it was a husband and wife screaming and yelling, and he kills her and then
Yeah.
makes it like she ran off and left the
Yeah,
baby.
no, that's happened.
And because you heard the baby
That's
monitor.
definitely happened, and also parrots. That's happened
Oh, I
too.
definitely-
I mean, it's not
I definitely
definitive,
used to
it's
do
not
that.
dispositive, but it could lead to things when the parrot is talking to the macaw or something, and it's saying, "Joey did it, Joey did it."
Yeah, I used a parrot in my first novel, which was a Sherlock Holmes novel. Because a friend of mine had a parrot, so I spent time around the bird, so I'm like, I'm going to use that. But then I got, of course, Sherlock Holmes readers are, shall we say, nerdy, and they really like to tell you what you get wrong. Apparently, I had given the parrot the wrong kind of plumage. But I was able to correct that in later editions.
Lady
Yay!
here has a question.
Yes,
So the question is, one of my characters was off the grid, tried to stay completely anonymous, and the worry is, do you give criminals a roadmap? I did. I gave criminals a perfect roadmap for how to get off the grid. Now, I don't know if anybody used it, because they haven't called me. And I say that to people. I say, well, if you, of course, let me see, this is like 4 or 5 years ago, so things have changed. So it wouldn't be as good a manual now because things keep changing so quickly. But I researched the hell out of that thing. And the other thing I tell people is you have to break the law these days to drop off the grid. You can't do it unless you do illegal things. It's really literally not possible. Take out your driver's license. You can't forge that. And you can't function in America without a driver's license. And now they've made it literally forgery proof, and you're same with your passport. So those kinds of identifications, you have to somehow steal them, get somebody, I did a lot of identity theft stuff, which has really helped this whole story, which I learned from a guy who was an expert in preventing identity theft, and he told me how to get around it. And I had bankers telling me how to launder money. I mean, it's, I had a stockbroker and a banker giving instructions on how to do this. And I said, geez, guys, what if can I put you in the acknowledgments? They said, yeah, don't worry about it.
Can I ask something, Chris, with your
Sure.
thing? How about Social Security? Because the old way they used to do it was they used to find someone who died
Yeah.
and took their Social Security
That's what I
number.
did.
Is that even doable anymore?
Oh, yeah. Oh, that's actually relatively easy, and that's what I did.
Because you can still get a driver's license once you can establish the Social Security.
That's really important, but it's risky because you are taking somebody's identity. But I did that in my book, and I learned that from the identity theft guy. My character picked somebody, his age, his configuration, and all that, who had died because he read 1 million obituaries. And he was in Connecticut. The story set in Connecticut, and he stole somebody's identity who was in Alaska. And it's basically a phishing call. They just call, said, "Oh, I'm so sorry for your loss, poor Eddie. You must be distraught." Yes. I'm calling from the Social Security Administration, and we have some money here was due to Eddie, and we have to return it to you folks, and I just need to confirm his Social Security number. I mean, you'd be amazed like the guy told me 1 out of 10 will just give it up. And because it's so far away, there's a lot of stuff in between Connecticut and Alaska, and he was able to secure that. And you're right, once you get that, then you can get, and your birth certificate, which is actually very easy to forge a birth certificate. I can show you how to do it, let me know. $50. It's really simple. how to get an embosser and the whole bit. When you have those two things, and then you get the driver's license, and then you're off to the races. Then you get a credit card and get a bank account and all that.
And then there's the simple thing that you could get the real thing, you just have to bribe the right people.
Well,
It
yeah.
still can be done.
That still can be done, but it's dangerous because now you got somebody who knows
Well, it's
what
all
you're doing
dangerous.
wrong. Not to dispute that, but it's if you want to go off the grid, you want to have nobody knowing that what you've done and how you do it. Now, something came up along the way, and I caught track of it about people, pushing back. So, Matt, anybody ever wrote you and a fan saying, "Hey, that's bullshit," or "You got that wrong," or
Not from a technical standpoint, but I can tell you that Amazon reviewers are some of the kindest people that you'll ever meet and some of the meanest people you'll ever meet. And there's really no gray area. They either love the book and tell you all the different ways they love it, or they hate every letter you typed on the page and spend paragraphs and paragraphs telling you how much they hated it. So that always cracks me up. And coming up before I actually got published, I would always hear authors say, "Oh, I don't read the reviews," and I always thought that was a bunch of BS. But I don't read the reviews at all. I kind of, once a month I'll go in and just see, what my rating is. Okay, it's 4 stars, hang it in there. But I don't. If I read everything, I would
shoot yourself.
Yeah, it's like, guys, I'm just trying to entertain you. It's art. It's totally fine if you don't like the book, but it's nothing personal. Like, I'm not trying to attack you. I'm just writing a book and throwing it out there, and it's crazy how intense some of that love and hatred.
That surprises me so much. Unbalanced people with an axe to grind on the internet.
How did that
Oh
happen?
my God. My publisher actually said if you don't get some bad reviews, no one will read the good ones. She said, "Oh, you got some bad reviews, that's really good because now it looks legitimate."
Well, I made one. Oh, get you, sir. I made one. The only time it's ever happened to me was that I stupidly put a safety on a clock. And anybody who knows guns, and I don't really know guns that well. I have a guy who knows guns, and I didn't consult him like an idiot. And there's no safety on a clock. And I got half a dozen. I wouldn't call them angry, but condescending.
Yes, but you have to remember how good it makes these people feel. You just have to remember that they live for this. There are people who live to tell you what you got wrong, and you have made them so happy.
It's particularly bad with the gun stuff, I have to say,
the guns are
because
crazy.
I once, back before I published any novels, I hadn't even published a novel yet, and I wrote a short story and sent it to a magazine, and obviously the guy was a gun fanatic, because I must have said something, this was long before the internet, it was hard to research stuff, and I said one thing wrong, and he wrote me a letter that was longer than the short story. At that point, and so that, so guns, you have to be very careful, and I've heard this from many, many authors, that, the gun people are crazy,
right.
and if you make a mistake, they will. Now, the funny thing is, with the Jimmy Vega, with my immigrant series, I think the problems that they may have with it may be more about the politics or different things or the way I present things, so they kind of stay away from that, because I think if they don't like me, they say they don't like me for another reason. But the firefighter series, every now and then I would have somebody who was from, my husband is a retired New York City fire chief, and I run things by him. I run things by other people who are very experienced, so if it's right, it's right. But I would have guys who were volunteer firefighters from, Deerfield, Illinois, who would write in and say, "There's no way that can happen, blah, 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 I know, and you're wrong." That's fine to write me personally, but they would write it on Amazon or things like that. And the problem is you can't attack them back. You're not allowed to do that. But the reality was they were wrong. And it's so annoying to think that this person from, some tiny little town, Gloversville, New York, has decided that in his great wisdom, you're wrong. When you know you're right because you talk to the top people and you're writing about the FDNY, and the people that you've talked to are the FDNY. So, and then you can't do anything like you just
I'm also a sailor, and the worst mistake I made was mixing up the red and the green buoys. And I'm not because I don't know the difference, but I'm kind of dyslexic. I do a lot of transpositioning, so it was really more of a mental thing. I got like 30 letters from angry sailors. I can't believe you called them the red. You said the red nun was green. You asshole. So, sir.
Apropos to security numbers. For a while, I haven't seen these either ads in magazines or the commercials on TV anymore, but for LifeLock, there was a man who said, "This is my company, and this is my social security number," and putting it out there. And I noticed something that I think for everybody in this room, even if we're over 30 or something, the 2 digits in the middle of the social security number, if it's a number 10 or greater, is always an even number.
Really?
If it's less than 10, it's always an odd number. So if your 2 digits are 03, if it's under 10, like you would have 03, 05, 07, but if you were 10 to 99, it was always an even number.
How did you find that out?
My father used to work for unemployment insurance, and I remember him telling me that. But apparently that no longer holds. I don't know why. Maybe they ran out of numbers or something like that. But for all old timers here,
Get the hell out of here.
that holds up.
See, you learn something every day.
It's like the old-time joke, you know, I'm not saying my mother-in-law's old, but her social security number's 3.
My middle number is 4.
No, could be.
My middle number is 44, so that certainly reinforces it.
Oh, we're all going to be checking it now.
Yeah, I
Everything
know.
is-
It's fascinating.
I wonder what the date. So guys, when you're studying forensics, does your family think you're planning a murder?
I will say that in front of all of you right now, I love my wife. We've been married for 21 years. But if anything ever happened to her and the police looked at my Google search history, I'm a dead man.
Yeah, I was just doing that last night. I was researching poisons, and I thought, oh, if the FBI comes, I'm just gonna have all these copies of my books. Like, here, take, yeah. I mean, yeah.
I get stopped at airports all the time, and I'm always wondering, geez, I mean, am I on some damn list because of my Google searching?
Yeah.
I mean, they do track that stuff, and you don't know if they're cross-referencing with your career.
Yeah, you look at undetectable poisons and
Yeah.
all that fun stuff.
I've been researching a lot of hate groups for something I'm doing, so that's not good. I'm
Oh, yeah.
researching both guns and hate groups. So that's a good thing.
Are you getting then like ads that are directed toward like,
No, funny
survivalists
enough,
and
no. And yet I can like look up one obscure thing about canoes, and all of a sudden I'll get 19 LLB ads asking me what do I
You
want to buy
might
a
also
canoe.
like
You might also really
this
like
kayak.
a kayak, yeah. So I don't know. I think maybe they've just decided at this point. I'll tell you, back before the internet was actually more interesting because when I was doing my first series, the series of the FDNY, back then you actually had to get hard paper stuff. You really weren't researching on the internet. So I had things like the Anarchist Cookbook, and I still have them, the real hardcore books from people who on how to make bombs. Back when I was doing that, back before 9/11, I got a guy to give me a tour of the Keystone Pipeline, and take me and show me all the different points of the pipeline that runs underneath New York City, and that goes right from JFK, because how do you think they get the fuel to JFK Airport? They don't truck it by car. It would be too dangerous. They put it on underground pipelines right to JFK Airport, and those fuel lines go all the way from Allentown, Pennsylvania and beyond. And those fuel lines go near schools, they go near hospitals, they go near everything. And back before 9/11, I had a tour.
How deeply are they buried?
I don't remember anymore. There's so much piping down there. I would say that it depends on where you are, because some of the stuff maybe, but nothing's ever happened. And actually, statistically, I guess their actuaries have figured this out. It's much more dangerous to have that stuff trekked over streets than it is on the underground. But they would never let me do that now. I mean, I had tours of, like Grand Central goes like about 8 stories down. Who would think? 8 stories down, and you can go all the way down, and there are steam pipes down there, and I used to get tours. Now it would be a little harder.
So research is a lot of fun.
Oh, it is.
I mean, you guys are making it clear that you really like doing it, and I think most writers do. Do you struggle a bit with I hear this all the time, especially from agents and editors saying, just because you learned it doesn't mean you put it in the book. So how do you, well, Matt, you mentioned that. I mean, how do you stop yourself from exposing all your hard-earned knowledge?
On first draft, I'll usually do, what I'll call a brain dump on whatever I didn't know, on the technical stuff. On the subsequent edits that I do, even before my editor sees it, I'll go through it a couple more times. And I'll read it, when I'm getting right at the point where I'm going to send it off to my editor, I'll read it as a fan, and then I'll start to pull out stuff that I think is bogging down. I'm much more, I'm a little bit different where, if you read a Michael Connelly book, there's a lot of police procedural in there and a little bit of action. I'm much more, half the book is police procedural investigation and half the book is the point of view from the family or somebody on the other side of the crime. That's the psychological thriller part. So I'm very cognizant of not bogging the reader down with too much detail because I just need them turning that page. Because at the end of the day, my fans and my publisher, they want a thriller more than anything else, and they want the suspense. So, I'll dump it just to get everything on the first draft, and then I'll start to pull away what I don't think that the reader necessarily needs to know.
Yeah.
Carol?
There's some writers that I had to write a signed review for Publishers Weekly of a very popular author who shall remain nameless because I didn't like her book, but and mostly the reason I didn't like the book was she just dumped every damn thing. I felt like she was like, oh, that's interesting, there it goes on the page, and I was like, oh God, if she were my student, I would have said your research is showing, but I couldn't because I had to sign the review, so I kind of just kind of soft pedaled what really irritated me, but it did irritate me because I felt like I was slogging through it. I mean, it's like, who reads the whaling chapters of Moby Dick? I know some of us do. I did, but
The Whiteness of the Whale, I read it a couple times. You guys have pointed out, and I think the audience might be getting the impression that forensic science has gotten to be so sophisticated, and there's so many things out there that now track us, and there's so much data, and it's so quick to take and analyze. Do you think it's going to come to a point where crime it's going to really wipe out crime? Is that possible?
no, because criminals always have they're always looking to be one step ahead, whether they are or not. Maybe this is a good time for a little story about early forensics. So in 1247 in China, this is the first recorded example of forensic entomology, which is bugs. So in China, in 1247, a local magistrate, there was a murder, and a local magistrate got all the farmers together, and they were pretty sure that the murder weapon was a scythe, which was very common because everyone had one. So the local magistrate got everybody together, and they all stood in an open field, and he had them lay down their scythes, and there was one scythe with flies just gathered on the blade, and he said, that's the murder weapon, and it so flustered the murderer that he actually ended up confessing. But it was like, the guy knew, there's a little blood, a little tissue on the scythe, so the flies are going to gather. So I feel like the forensic scientific mind is always looking for the flies on the scythe. And there'll always be something, that to look for that no one thought of to look for.
I think one of the things to keep in mind is that most crimes, while forensics is really cool, actually most crimes are pretty obvious.
I was just going to say that.
Yeah,
They're crimes of passion or something.
It's a lot of times people just give themselves away pretty obviously. So the number of times that the police have to really resort to high-tech forensics isn't that much anyway. I mean, most of the time it's like, the guy comes in, he says, yeah, he was calling me names, and yeah, he was doing this. Next thing you know, they just give it, and then really good police interrogation can do a whole lot of things. So while there's these really sophisticated crimes, and they're out there, I mean, I just read the other day that they now had the first cybercrime that was able to mimic the voice of a person. So there was this particular person's voice that was used to give commands, and this crime was able to completely mimic that voice and to be able to give those buy-sell commands and transfer commands to have all this money transferred to this other account. and then it's gone. So I think those crimes are going to continue to exist, but only at the highest levels, because they take a lot of sophistication, and a lot of crimes are not very sophisticated.
Yeah, you're right about the interviews and the interrogation techniques, but again, science has informed that.
Yeah.
Behavioral science, and I got to interview a guy who was like considered the best interrogator in Connecticut. And at the end of our discussion, he demonstrated how he approaches it, and I was ready to confess. I said, okay, I did it. I don't know what I did, but you know, just the way he moved, he moved from being an interview to an interrogation. And that's another thing that you want to keep track of if you're writing mysteries or thrillers. That an interview is an interview. You're talking to them, you're trying to learn something, but at the moment they think that, okay, this guy did it, then it shifts into an interrogation. It's a whole different kind of approach, and it's very much based on behavioral science and a lot of technology. Well, okay, the question is about interrogations. One of the cops in the show was very aggressive, and I guess it was good cop, bad cop kind of approach, where one was more empathetic. And is that legal? Yeah, it's legal. You can have a common sense notion about where the line is drawn.
Not just a good cop, bad cop, but I mean, this guy can be very impressive.
If you don't, I think in most places, if you don't exert physical force, it's legal.
Yeah.
And the other thing that's legal, which people are always surprised about, is you can lie all you want.
Right, the police can lie to suspects, there's nothing illegal about that.
There's nothing illegal. They can say on anything. You know, your buddy Harry sold you out. He said you were there on the corner, you know, and he said, oh, Harry.
The science of police interviews has really advanced a lot, and again, I watch a lot of real police interviews, and what the technique that's the most effective with most criminals is the police give the criminal the idea that they're their friend. I mean, that's how John Douglas and Robert Ressler got serial killers to talk to them in the first place. That's how, you know, I don't know if any of you have seen Mindhunter, but it's about John and Robert's, you know, early years in the FBI. And that's how they did that. Is the idea is to not to come off aggressively, but to try and eliminate the boundary between you and the criminal, so the criminal trusts you and thinks that you're their friend, and then they start to relax, and that's when things are most effective. I think the best television show that does the best interviews, there's a British show called Scott and Bailey. It's about two women cops in London, and it might be actually in Northern City. But anyway, I feel like Scott and Bailey has incredibly realistic interview scenes that look exactly like the real scenes that, you know, I watch on these shows.
It also depends to some degree on what the police want from that person. Because let's say if that's their main suspect and they're looking for that person to convict, that's different than, say, somebody who is, you know, maybe they want this person to turn and they want this person to give up the evidence. And then there's also the whole thing that the police often will give, like let's say you're dealing with a pedophile. You want to give that person a way you want the police officer to give them a narrative that allows them permission to confess to the crime. Because if you come and you go, oh, you piece of filth, you did it, you've shut off any chance that they're going to do it. But if you go, listen, you know, I can see you're under stress there, and I can see, you know, so what happens a lot of times is the police, depending on what they're looking for, a lot of times, they will give the narrative, or at least begin to give a narrative. If they're looking for like let's say they want to know where a body is or something. It really depends. If they don't, you know, if they want that person and they want it clean and they don't want a judge to come back and say you force-fed something, they won't do this. But if they're looking for, like, where's the body, we need the forensic evidence, they might come, listen, I understand what you were trying to do with this, you were under some stress, and they give a narrative so that this person has a sense that he's being understood, she's being understood.
Right, so like if the guy killed his wife, you know, they'll like, you know, I know look, my wife irritates me all the time. She made you mad, right? I mean, you know, women can be so, and they like try and establish this bond where the other person, you know, thinks that they're on their side.
Yeah, I've never spoken to any cop who's involved in anything like that who didn't use that form of empathy. And I think that's almost universally true. The aggressive cop I mean, because that all of a sudden then the perpetrator will, all their pushback, responses will just kick in. And the other thing is like, well, it's, controversy about torture. Again, the torture, if you've got somebody getting tortured, they'll tell you anything. They don't care. I mean, at that point, so it doesn't work. Besides being cruel and inhumane and immoral, it just really doesn't work. All the gains that were made in the intelligence world with terrorists or other combatants were done through creating a bond. And that far and away works.
It has been a process, though, because 20 or 30 years ago, I mean, you had juveniles who were convicted 20, 30 years ago because they were deprived of sleep, they were deprived of counsel, they were yelled at, they were threatened, and they confessed to crimes they didn't commit. I mean, Jeff Deskovic would be the local one to be well known.
My high school, he was my schoolmate for many years.
Central
So,
Park.
yeah, so he,
Central Park.
so it's changed. I think partially because judges will push back if they think that something was coerced. So there's been a sophistication in the judicial system that doesn't say, oh well, cops will be cops. No. So the police also know if they want this guy or they want this criminal, they got to be careful. Especially the higher the profile of the criminal, the less likely they are to do anything that goes outside those bounds.
Right, because the last thing they want is a confession that gets thrown out.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Because then you're in fruit of the poisonous tree, and anything that you find from the confession can be thrown out too.
The Central Park 5, you guys might know about that. That really was, that changed the game. And it was horrible. And I think that's been changed radically, at least in our part of the world. I don't know about the rest of the country, but it's just not going to happen anymore. Any questions? Yes, ma'am.
How do you get your idea to before you start a book? Is it something you read or something you've seen or how
Should we go in order?
Answer your question.
Oh, you want to speak?
Yes, go ahead,
Answer the
Matt.
question?
Repeat the question.
How do you get your ideas?
So with me, so there's two types of writers. There's a pantser and a plotter. A pantser, which I am one, kind of writes by the seat of their pants. I don't really plot too much out. So I'll get an idea, and I have absolutely, I can't tell you where they come from. I'll be driving, I'm in the shower, I'm falling asleep, I'm bored at work, whatever the case may be. But I typically will just get a scene in my head. I don't know who the characters are yet, I don't know who the people are in the scene, but I've got this scene. And then I'll kind of reverse engineer who's there in the scene, why they're there, what's happening. Come up with what I think would be the beginning of the book, of the story, what I think might be the end. I have absolutely no idea how I'm going to get there, and I kind of just start. And in everything published and unpublished that I've written, I would say 90% of the time, the person who I think is the killer when I start to read the book is not the killer by the time I get to the end. So that's how I do it.
I would agree with Matt that I often try to be just like the reader. I don't know who did it either to some degree. My books are very character driven. I have 2 series and characters first. I mean, for all the forensics we're talking about, it's this much. Characters, everything. So for me, it's always about my characters and growing my characters and what's going on with them. And so the forensics always has to fit into, so it always starts with a story that I want to tell about what's happening in their lives, the type of crime that will elucidate something that's going on in our world. So for the fire series, a lot of it had to do with my female fire marshal being a woman in a very male world, and it had to do with a lot of the relationships and the situations going on there. With my immigrant series, it has to do with the real things that are going on in the immigrant community today, and the immigrants are sometimes victims, sometimes they're witnesses, and so my main character is a Puerto Rican police detective in this county, so it's how he comes apart through things, and a lot of it is his life story going through the books too. So it's all character, and it's always about a person, and the forensics actually just plays into that.
Carol?
For me, place is really important. So like, I started this Edinburgh series, that's the first book, Edinburgh Twilight. I just finished the 3rd. Because I spent a week in Edinburgh and it just blew me away. Like, it just grabbed my heart, and I just like needed to spend time there. And like, how can I spend more? Oh, I can write about it. And so like, Google Maps, here I come. So, you know, for me, it's like a setting could just be absolutely take me to everything that I need, and then everything falls in place. Also, I like real life events. I've written several things that were based on, like I wrote a play about physics, and it was based on a real train ride that these three physicists had taken, and they were going from a physics conference at Oxford to London on a train to see Copenhagen, which is a play about physics, and they were on a train, which is, you know, Einstein's chief metaphor in his one of his relativity theories. I think it's special relativity. But so I was like, this is too beautiful, and then I kind of mulled over it, and I'm like, someone's got to write about this. Someone's got to write about this train ride, and it was like, okay, fine, I'll do it. Someone's got it. So I wrote a play, and it was done off Broadway, and it's being picked up again by another company. But it's like really, you know, it just, the event itself seemed so beautiful and perfect to me that I just obsessed about it. So
I think that writers, I think there's a little bit of a reverse of your question, because I think that most writers write because they have a lot of ideas. And I've never known a writer who didn't have a lot more ideas than they had the time or energy to put it up on the page.
you know, Harlan Ellison used to say, when people came up to him and they said, where'd you get your ideas? He said, well, there's a place in Schenectady. Once a month I send away some money and they send me 6 ideas.
And you know, the other thing is that if you're in the creative arts, I mean, I spent my professional career in advertising. I was a copywriter, and I had to come up with ideas. It was my livelihood, and I had to come up with them right away. And I didn't have any chance to, so you actually can just sit there and go, okay, I need an idea. What is it going to be? And then your brain will just kind of, and this is going to sound really ridiculous, but these guys know what I'm talking about. It'll come to you. You know, to me, it's more a matter of what's a good idea. What's an idea that actually has got legs? What's an idea that isn't a borrowing from something else that I've seen or heard? What's an original idea, or at least original enough that it's going to be distinctive, and can I play it out through a whole book or a short
That's
story?
the thing, what you were just saying, Chris, but can I play it out? Because one of the problems I find is I get very excited, and I start in, and everything's really good until I hit that first roadblock, like, okay, I don't know where this is going to go.
Isn't that fun? But then you got to figure it out.
Yeah.
You know, and I'm mostly a pantser too, but I need to know the ending, because it took me, I got rejected 3 times before I said, you know, I'm not, my plotting isn't good enough. So the first book where I thought, okay, I'm going to know who did it. So I'm going to know how to start it, and I'm going to know who did it. How I get there, I'm going to feel my way around. But, and then that worked. And so from then on, I've changed the ending a couple of times, like these guys do. But mostly I like to know who the bad guy is. And then that also gives me opportunity to throw in a bunch of red herrings and misdirections and all that kind of stuff. But everybody's different. You know, another common question is, what's your process? Everybody's different. And there's no one good way or bad way. It all depends on your own mind and your own creative approach to things. Yes, ma'am.
So, Suzanne and Brian, you've got 2 different ideas, so you create 2 different characters. But Carol, you use different names. Is that more for branding?
What?
Why do you write under different names?
Why do I write in different names? Because my publishers told me to. It has to do with genre. So, like my first 2 books were Sherlock Holmes novels, and then my next series was a cozy series, and those were all under my name. But then my next series was contemporary thrillers, so they wanted me to have a pen name for that. So I chose my mother's maiden name, so Lawrence, so C.E. Lawrence. So, and the reason I used initials for the silent series is that this isn't sexism. This is just kinky. The vast majority of readers are women. The vast majority of readers of thrillers are women. Women like to read books about serial killers that have been written by men. And so, or that they can imagine have been written by men. So when I was given the task of choosing a nickname for the contemporary thrillers, which were all serial killer, a profile of searching serial killers, I was told to do initials to keep my gender sort of a little mysterious. So if a woman saw the book, oh, it could be a man. and again, that's not sexism, it's just,
Well, that's the J.K.
It's
Rowling
kinky.
story.
Yeah.
That's the J.K. Rowling story, that what she was going to do, Joanne Rowling, and then they said, no boy is going to read Joanne Rowling.
Oh, right, yeah, boy, yeah. And also, this is, since we're talking about, who will read what, there's a, and I don't know if it's true, but allegedly in children's fiction and YA, girls will read books that have male or female protagonists, but boys really only want to read books that have male protagonists. So there you go.
And movies are the same.
Because the publishing is riddled with all these ridiculous constraints. They're very, very sensitive about genre. You get typecast, just like as actors get typecast. If you're a thriller writer, you can't write a cozy. I mean, it's the marketing. The marketing is really what drives that. And, if they say, we're not publishing this book, if you're going to write under your own name, we're just not, it doesn't matter how big you are.
Stephen King, Anne Rice, and Joyce Carol Oates all write under pen names. So Anne Rice, I think, writes romance. I'm not sure what Stephen King writes as his other genre. And Joyce Carol Oates writes something that's less.
What's he doing now? Was his first 3 books? Because he wrote
I
3
heard
books
that he
early.
did. I heard that
Okay.
I heard that he still does it. But I mean, these are really, really well-known
Yeah,
writers
it's-
whose names sell books.
It's those idiots in publishing, I'm sorry. Nobody out there is in publishing. And the thing with the sexist gender stereotyping, I had one of my series was really a trilogy that was protagonist was a female, and I got to keep my name Chris because I thought, well, they'll think Chris is Christine. So you don't have to change your name, really. So, and I did get fan mail saying, oh, Miss Knopf, I really liked your book. Thank you.
I'll tell you a funny story on that. When I had a long period, about an 11-year break between my 2 series because I was raising my kids and I didn't have time to write anymore. So I was writing the Georgia series and under my real name, Suzanne Chazen. And when I came to write my Jimmy Vegas series, I actually thought I should have a pen name because I thought the first series were thrillers. And the second series are more mysteries, and they're very heavily character driven. They're a different type of they're still in the same area, but they're different. And I gave myself a pen name, and I set up everything for one whole day until my agent said, "No, you're going to keep your real name." And so it was the shortest thing. I killed my alter ego in one day. I set up Instagrams, I set up Facebook, I set up everything, and one day later I took them all down.
Yeah, and just one more point on that. I don't think their publishers are right about that. I think you give up your name, you give up the equity you've built up. So I've got a fan base. I mean, I have several different fan bases for the different series, but there's cross-fertilization there. And if you come out with a whole different name, you've lost all that.
That's what she said.
All that,
That's
you know,
right.
I mean, I came out of marketing, and we call that brand equity, and you've given it all up. I think it's absurd. And by the way, these really famous people, they'll put out one book and then maybe 2, and then it'll be so-and-so, Stephen King writing as, and I'm thinking, well, how stupid is that? Anyway, that's, I won't rant too much on that. I think we're at our time limit. That's true, Joe. We're 1 minute over.
Any other last questions?
Any other last questions?
Thank you
Thank you for
so much.
having us.